Hi, I'm Mike Hutjens, Extension Dairy Specialist at the University of Illinois. Today we're going to talk about feeding to reduce your carbon footprint. Certainly, this is a logical place to start looking at our consumers because this is not going to go away. But the good news for both producers and consumers, this is a win-win topic as you see as we go through the various points looking at greenhouse gases. But certainly, we know that these companies are going to be looking at carbon footprints here in the future. Let's begin by looking at the different types of emissions that come from livestock farms. Listed on the left side of the PowerPoint, you can see this is referenced from NRC 2003. What's really interesting to me is I'm not going to walk you through all these, but if you look at the impact, you can see the big impactor, the most major one is ammonia. That's as far as impact goes in the environment. You can see odors, particulate sizes, they are insignificant. So then you go to the next column, neighbors. What are your people? What do the consumers think about? And look at this, folks. This table is inverted. In other words, they don't worry much about ammonia because they don't smell it unless you get really close to certain livestock facilities. But of course, odor is a big one at this point. And then the third column says, well, what does each of these emission things do to the environment? Climate change, quality of life, health, you can see that. So that's a very important PowerPoint to kind of study to see what are the big players, what are the concerns, and then what are your consumers thinking about these various emissions. Now let's look at the big three. We look at greenhouse gases, and throughout the entire presentation, we'll be using GHG, standing for greenhouse gas. Carbon dioxide, everything is pretty much converted back to carbon dioxide equivalents, because this is what the standards we would say. The smoking gun, of course, is methane, and this is one where the ruminant animal gets involved with, because it produces methane from the fermentation and of the rumen gases, and then all rumen carbohydrates, and then also as far as fecal emissions as well. And of course, the big 100-pound gorilla is a nitrogen oxide. And you can see that's even bigger, although not quite as big a player when it comes to the dairy farm. This data from South Dakota State looks at agriculture contributions. So we are a player. Obviously, so are our coal emission plants and cars and buses. But certainly, we are a player, and you can see right around 30%. This data summarized and presented from the South Dakota specialist here. So we have a dog in this hunt, as we would say. Now let's look at the milk carbon footprint. Brand new data coming out of our think tank group out of Chicago. You can see that 5 different areas. Feed production, as far as greenhouse gases and carbon footprint, about 20% comes from feed production. That's us. Production of alfalfas and grasses and forages and grains. Look at the big 100-pound gorilla here, milk production. It's big. So that's us. We're simply saying, since we can affect 52% of the carbon footprint, what can we do about that? Then you can see transportation and processing of your milk and dairy products, the retail stores, and then, of course, consumption, people driving to the store, and, of course, people disposal of products that are not being consumed. So basically, this PowerPoint says we have opportunities to impact carbon footprint, and we'll see why that's a win-win situation here in just a few minutes. Now, needless to say, the government is not going to be silent on this. Let's just look ahead here a bit. In 2012, the European Union is looking to implement and print the carbon footprint label on the product. So when you get your gallon of milk or pound of butter, it's going to tell you calories, percent fat, the daily requirements for human, and then it's going to say carbon footprint, as well as perhaps your beans and your peas and your soy products. So they're going to tell consumers, what this number is going to be. This will be important when you look at such things as organic milk versus the traditional milk, what I call green milk, which has the smallest carbon footprint. Our Secretary of Agriculture signed an accord in Denmark a couple of years ago looking that the dairy carbon footprint will be reduced by 25%, I believe by 2020 was the deadline. So you say, well, how are we going to do that? The answer is very easy. And of course, New Zealand already has imposed a tax on animals to conduct research to try to reduce greenhouse gases. A couple of years ago, our government got involved with the Clean Air Act and Carbon Council Initiative, and they were going to tax our animals. And you can look at the scope of this. Now, if some of our dairy people think about this, 2009 was an ugly year in dairy. Most dairymen lost $300 to $500, and the government said, oh, by the way, we're going to tax you another $175. This one went away very, very quickly. A tremendous effort by the livestock groups across the United States and consumer groups as well. But the point is, the government thought about this. It may not be in the front burner, but I think it's still on the stove. So let's talk about this change ahead and carbon footprint. 3 take-home points. We'll go through them slowly. Number 1, hypothesis number 1 says express greenhouse gases per unit of dairy product. What do we mean by that? It simply says, let's not do it per cow. Remember, our cows, as you can see from this PowerPoint here, gave a lot less milk back 40, 50 years ago. You can see over the last 20 years approximately, or 15 years, you can see that greenhouse gases increase about 3 to 4%. But look at the production. Meat, milk, and eggs up 50, 20, and 30%. So obviously, as we increase production, we end up reducing greenhouse gases and emissions. Remember that. Don't ever forget that. Take a look at the bottom one. This is from Cornell University, in which they look at the greenhouse gas per pound of milk, 7.7 pounds in 1944, and 2007, 2.8 pounds. There is well over a 60% reduction in greenhouse gases, and primarily led through improvement in genetics, feeding, and management of dairy cattle. Hypothesis number 2. High-producing cows is what you're targeting to reduce greenhouse gases. Don't forget that one at this stage of the game. And why does that occur? Well, primarily high-producing cows, and we'll do this backwards in yellow, high-producing cows dilute down the maintenance tax, which we'll talk about here in just a second. Remember, every cow that weighs 1,400 pounds has the same energetic requirements for maintenance as her neighbor down the road or next to her in the barn or in the free stall. So that's important. So the more milk I get, the smaller percent of the nutrients, or dry matter in this case, is committed to maintenance. Then you can look at another very important point. I call it the feed tax. Every morning your Holstein cow gets up. She has to take the first 13 pounds of dry matter to maintain her body, to replace tissue, worn out cells, to breathe, to cool, to keep warm, whatever maintenance functions, to walk you want to perform. For a Jersey cow, it's only 10 pounds. Well, folks, that's a big number, and that's going to come back, something that we're really going to think about in the future, and simply saying smaller cows will have a smaller carbon footprint, and they'll be more efficient. We'll have some vivid discussions, I'm sure, about this one in the future. Hypothesis number 3, which is actually the rest of the program. What can you and I, as dairy managers, dairy nutritionists, veterinarian, do to reduce the carbon footprint through nutrition? So let's look at some of these alternatives. The first one will be forages. What can we do in the forage aspect of it? Well, let's look at some research literature, and I think clearly some take-home messages will emerge. This comes from Scotland. They used equations. Now, I put that in orange because some of this are modeling. They're not actual cow data. They looked at methane expressed in terms of liters of milk rather than pounds like we do, or gallons at this point, and 2 take-home points. Unfortunately, the higher proportion of concentrate, this will reduce methane production. Now, when corn gets up at $6 or $7 a bushel, that has some interesting ramifications. The good news is, however, in this study, high forage quality also reduces methane production produced to low quality. So there's 2 importance to write down if you're going to take a test in terms of how are we going to reach the accord that was signed by our Secretary of Ag. In another study from Denmark, Johannes et al., they looked at methane production. Here they were looking at, again, forage quality. And here are the hard numbers. You can look at early maturing grasses versus late maturing grasses, and then also comparing that to corn silage. So there's another take-home message. Even though corn silage requires fair amounts of nitrogen and other fertility, it still wins when it comes to greenhouse gases. Remember, now we're working on that production end of the forage element that we talked about a bit earlier. And, of course, high digestible forages reduce methane production. So for my producers, that means NDFDs. We're going to be looking at feeds that have high NDFDs. We did another simulation using data from some Pennsylvania dairy farms. And here we're looking at production systems. Alfalfa production in this study was somewhat more efficient than corn production. We didn't say corn silage. We didn't say what form it was, simply looking at the actual production of that crop. In this study, alfalfa had a slight edge. Corn silage won over non-permanent grassland studies in this one here. And then, of course, they did look at the breed effect. And this has been published in the journal Dairy Science now, that basically small cows, and I think that's the key. It doesn't say Jersey. They use jerseys, but small cows had a 20% improvement in greenhouse gas and therefore carbon footprint. We then go to a Irish study. We looked at pasture-based systems, and this is kind of a mixed slide in which it says they can be profitable and they can decrease greenhouse gases, but management becomes important, the type of cow we have on this, and stocking rates. So it becomes a management factor. And this is going to be true when we look at all these hints on greenhouse gases. A quick word about fats and oils. The most useful study just recently published by the group out of Canada looked at a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis says it looked at 27 published studies using added fats and oils. So this is a powerful study. And good news, in some respects, there is a linear relationship that as you increase the fat content or oil content in the ration, you lower methane production. You are impacting the rumen fermentation. Remember that, because that's going to come back a number of times now as we start wrapping up and looking at other alternatives. Their guideline was for every 10 grams increase in fat/oil, they got a 1 gram decrease in methane production per kilogram of dry matter intake. The last one was surprising to me. I thought there might be some impacts if it was canola versus it was, say, tallow. But fed at normal levels, the form, meaning seed versus oil, saturation versus unsaturation, or fat source, was not impacting the results. That surprised me a little bit, but that is what the data came up with. Just to show another study, this is a canola study coming from Denmark. So you can see this research is not confined to the U.S. In fact, there's probably more European research going on than there is in the U.S. at this stage of the game, and reflects that same impact that the Canadian meta-analysis shows, that as we fed oil, but in this case, reduced dry matter intake. Write that down on your piece of paper. That's another take-home message. Anything I can do to decrease dry matter intake and maintain milk production always is going to increase feed efficiency, which is always going to reduce carbon footprint, and you can see the amount of methane, what the reduction was at. Let's go to another one, protein. Some of you may be thinking about it. There's not a lot of action here. A very nice study done looking at the impact of dietary proteins. It's a Spanish study done in a tie-stall barn. They looked at very typical protein levels in the diet. And the good news is no difference in nitrogen oxide production. That's huge because remember, that was the 100-pound gorilla that can really drive greenhouse gases. No big surprise. As you feed more protein, they got more milk yield in terms of protein yield. That's always good news. However, as you feed more protein, you decrease in efficiency. That'll be another discussion in the future, looking at protein efficiencies in high-producing cows. Obviously, we lose some protein. And however, there was an linear increase in ammonia gases. Remember, our consumers? They'd be nervous about that. So certainly, ammonia gases, while not a big player in greenhouse gases, certainly affects the types of emissions that come from dairy facilities. Now let's go through kind of what I call the speed round, looking at feed additives and other inclusions that could impact greenhouse gases. Well, here comes the first big one, monensin, or for many of our listeners, we'd call that rumensin here. A study done showing a decrease in methane production. At this stage of game, an increase in feed efficiency. PEM is a European essential oil, and it too had a big impact. So certainly rumensin and organic oils are going to be big players in terms because they impact rumen fermentation. And anytime you and I can impact rumen fermentation, that really means that we're going to have some impact on greenhouse gases. So those two are winners, no question about it. Why would you use monensin versus over the oils? Probably two reasons. About 1/3 the price per cow per day, and we're not quite sure which oils and how many grams of those oils we have to feed. So a lot more research on the essential oils need to be done. That work will probably come from Europe because, of course, rumensin is not allowed to be fed to dairy cows in the EU. Oregano, this is a Pennsylvania study. I'll let you read this. A big-time player. First, notice 17.5 ounces. That's a pound of oregano. Notice on the bottom bullet, probably economics is prohibitive. But these studies are being done to kind of get an idea what can work. Again, we're coming through the essential oils. There's 40 different oregano plants. Doesn't that make you a little nervous? Knowing which one is the winner? And you can see the various essential oils and various concentrations you find in those oregano extracts. But again, you can see a big impact in terms of methane production. Some glycerol work. Glycerol coming now from a byproduct from the biodiesel area. A Korean study done in vitro here. You can see that glycerol reduced methane production, increased rumen propionate. So this really mimics the concentrate story. So not a big surprise here. And in some cases, glycerol can be cheaper than actually looking at starch coming from corn or barley sources. So again, it says we're impacting the rumen fermentation. We decrease methane production. What about hops, a product used in the brewing industry? Again, you can see it did have some impact here in total gas production and methane production at this point, and did change the VFA production in the rumen. These are simulations with 3 different varieties of hops, and the bad news is not all 3 studies perform the same way. So again, interesting data, but not very practical to go to the dairy farm today with. Here comes a study looking at some other products like nitrates. There's actually a couple of them here. They looked at 4 different levels of nitrates. Those are extremely high levels. If those are coming from feedstuffs, you'd have nitrate toxicity concerns, but it did have an impact. However, it only occurred in one of the studies, and that was really significant. So again, interesting study, but wow, tough to repeat, and the level's pretty scary as far as that goes. In this same study, on these in vitro analysis, they looked at sulfate, no impact, and corn gluten did not have any change on methane production as well, and you might expect that because it's fairly high in fiber. Let's look at these other ones quickly. These are coming from other animals in some cases. Steam flake corn had a lower methane production compared to conventionally processed corn. Probably reflects, again, a rumen response. It looks like if we can reduce protozoa numbers, we reduce the amount of methane being produced. Again, that controversy on what role protozoa play in here, because obviously protozoa metabolize in the rumen. In many cases, they metabolize bacteria. And so you can see that if we knock that out, we could reduce methane production. Unsaturated fatty acids lowered methane production. I think that's a winner. Even though the Canadian data didn't pick up on that one, I think you'll see more of that. Saponins, which are products in forages, you can see they reduce, and tannins, both of them have impacts in terms of methane production and rumen VFAs. Again, the variability in the studies have to be pointed out. And of course, if you're into cashew nut shells, it looks like that's a winner. I'm not quite sure how practical that's going to be, but certainly you can see we're looking at a lot of different approaches in this area. Well, let's go now and apply this as we wrap up. I want to show you 2 examples, case studies in which this carbon footprint really has a win for dairy producers. The first one we'll look at is feed efficiency and greenhouse gases. Hopefully your cows aren't burning quite this hot as this cow is showing here, but obviously she's flaming off all her methane from the rumen. That's supposed to be a joke. Here comes your feed efficiencies. We've got this on our websites, and you can come back and actually listen to an entire discussion on feed efficiency if you wish. But simply shows in terms of the amount of milk, 3.5 fat-correcting milk produced per pound of dry matter consumed. And of course, the key here, of course, less dry matter makes smaller carbon footprint, and also means a less carbon footprint per pound of milk, per pound of butter, per gallon of milk, however you want to express it. The equation on the bottom is there if you wish to make some conversions. Fat-corrected milk, you can also use energy-corrected milk. There are equations for that as well. The real take-home message sits here, of course, is that we look at this case study, 70 pounds of milk. With today's feed prices, this would be in 2012 around 12 to 13 cents per pound of dry matter. You can see if I get that same 70 pounds of milk with a feed efficiency of 1.2, it takes 58 pounds of dry matter. If I could do it for 1.8, which is extremely high, only for 39 pounds. So you can see a tremendous drop in dry matter intake, which also means there's a savings. Look at the cost savings you'd be seeing there for the dairy farmer. That's a win for the dairy farm, but it also means less methane being produced. Here are some guidelines from Norman St. Pierre from Ohio State University looking at what these numbers should look like. Feed efficiency is looking at rolling herd averages. And then you can also look at bulk tank averages as well. So you can see the higher milk production, we end up getting greater feed efficiency. And of course, we already stated that clearly, that also reduces carbon footprint because of the 13-pound tax if they happen to be Holstein cows. So what are the factors that affect feed efficiency? Well, we could spend 10 minutes on this whole PowerPoint. Well, we'll just click them up here slowly for you. The orange ones are big players. I call them heavy hitters. So these are ones that can really impact feed efficiency. And so you can see there are 4 of them highlighted here. There is data in the research on every one of these say that you can change feed efficiency, which means lowering greenhouse gases. Days in milk reflect reproduction and milk yield. Forage quality looks at rumen fermentation and dry matter intake. Mastitis, of course, just indicates milk quality and milk production. By the way, the Iowa State people indicate when cows have a disease challenge, their maintenance requirement goes up about 40%. There's another one of those taxes you get to pay there. And of course, rumen acidosis simply means the rumen is not working very efficiently. All these other ones are players as well. This is a herd here in the Midwest, simply showing what feed efficiency numbers can look like. If you look over here, and some of you may want to print this one off, a very good herd, by the way, a very good Midwest herd. Here you can look at the feed efficiencies on cows and early lactation, mid lactation, late lactation, and on heifers. And of course, here's your hospital pen reflecting the Iowa State data. You really lose the efficiency there because you lose milk, and then of course you also increase some of the immune function requirements as well. A second area to look at quickly is older heifers, a real opportunity for greenhouse gases again. Basically, there's interest in limit feeding animals. This is a farm. This is a dairy farm. They're simply saying if we can feed less dry matter, I'm able to feed these heifers cheaper. I can avoid fat or heavy heifers, which continues to be a challenge on many dairy farms because they're not on pasture running around anymore. They're more in confinement. I can reduce feed costs, and I can look at different ways to get this accomplishment done out there. So this is a dairy producer slide. Now let's take a look, however, at feed efficiency. Pat Hoffman did this study several years ago. It's classic, guys. It's classic. We look at this. The C at 100 means basically the control diet, 100% intake. Restricted means 90% of the feed at the 100% level. So restrict these animals by 10% of dry matter. R80 means 20% of the dry matter. Now, there is a ton of data on this slide. I think the thing you want to see, however, is looking at the top one, is that we maintain the protein and the mineral levels and the non-fiber carbohydrates. So we don't underfeed the animal. We just pack those nutrients in fewer pounds of dry matter. Then you can come down to the next one. You can see energy intake is very similar in all three cases in terms of the amount of energy expressed as TDN or the net energy system. So what we're doing is restricting dry matter, but in most cases, that's fiber or carbs, not proteins and micronutrients. Here is the data. Again, a very, very complete slide. And rather than just give you bulletin items, you can study these or you can print these out. And again, you can see the initial weights, the final weights. The bottom line is in green on growth. And it simply says these animals, much what the beef people told us would happen, when restricted feed intake, these animals actually had a better average daily gain and a better conversion of feed efficiency. Now, if you're looking at carbon footprint, there it is down in blue, excretion. Notice we're getting out of the manure business by almost 2 pounds of manure dry matter. I didn't say 2 pounds of manure. 2 pounds of manure dry matter, and a lot of manure is 80 to 85% moisture. So you can see, we're talking big shovels at this stage of the game. Now, does the behavior change? Yes. Certainly eating times, standing times, they will be quite vocal, especially the first couple of weeks at this stage of the game because they're hungry until they adjust to this at this stage of the game. But you can see that the behavior of the animal will change as well. But the good news is they grew and grew very well. Now, the question is, well, what happened to milk production? So we did this little bar graph here looking at 305-day milk in the first lactation. And that's the last data I've seen from Pat Hoffman there. But you can see why these are not statistically significantly different. Pretty interesting trend, isn't it? Trend is certainly, they don't go down. It actually goes up a little bit. So certainly while you don't give up any milk, you might enhance it, but being a researcher, you cannot make that claim, but it's kind of a win-win at this stage of the game. So another approach was done by Dr. Judd Heinrich at Penn State, and they looked at limit feeding high concentrate diets. And so similar to pretty much what Pat Hoffman has done, we also have a third one in which we look at using very bulky feed ingredients. And while that will reduce costs, the problem is you get a lot of manure. So same thing happens here with the high concentrate. You limit feed of higher concentrate diets. They see a higher digestibility of organic dry matter and NDF because it means that feed is more effectively used, and we see improvement in nitrogen retention. In other words, we lose less nitrogen away from the animal in terms of growth in this stage of the game. Why do we think about this? Well, certainly Dr. Heinrich points out that certainly some years when there's scarce forages, i.e. 2011, we can use some lower commodity feed prices, such as some of your corn gluten feeds and distillers grain. Obviously, this whole CAFU issue comes to part, the whole thrust of this PowerPoint, the greenhouse gases, and then, of course, the ability to reduce manure volume and ammonia loss, which are really going to be pretty important. We just bulleted the data because it's very, very complete. Feel free to contact Dr. Heinrich if you want to see the data. The high forage diet, you can see almost a difference there of about 1.2 pounds dry matter difference. So already now you know, bing, ding, ding, greenhouse gases win at this point. No difference in growth and performance, which is important. They did a second trial. They went from a 75 to 25% forage diet. Not sure you and I want to go quite that low, but the point is we did see a cost reduction in this study study was done. We probably would have seen that in 2011 as well. And we already talked again in this study, this nitrogen efficiency, and that will be another story in the future besides greenhouse gases and feed efficiency. We're going to look at nitrogen efficiency. Manure output, look at that, folks. Tremendous difference in manure output in these ones. And again, optimal growth was occurring. Now, if you're going to manage limited feed heifers, I thought we should talk about a couple of important points. Bunk space is critical. Everybody better be on board when the feed comes there because it could be gone in 1 to 3 hours as far as that goes, or what's left is basically refusals or sorted feeds. We want to make sure we adjust the rations so we meet the nutrient requirements of grams and pounds of minerals, vitamins, trace minerals, and protein. Grouping of heifers will be critical because obviously big heifers can really eat an awful lot of feed. You don't want to be limit feeding different sized heifers. Vocalization can be occurring, and my mother would never allow that on our farm. She did not would not allow that, to be honest with you. Cost of forages, grains, and byproducts will be important. Some years it could be very beneficial, other years maybe less advantage. And the real opportunity looks to be in older heifers, probably in that 10-month to calving age window as far as that goes. So let's summarize. What do we talk about here? Well, the data we produced is, number one, big, probably should be in green letters. Increasing milk yield is no question. Anytime you can do that, you're going to reduce greenhouse gases. You're also going to make some more money. The use of RBST, no question, that reduces greenhouse gases by 8%. Think about that. I think we're going to see some of our processors and milk bottlers look at this and simply say, we want to be green, and that's the new word I'm using, green milk. So if you're producing green milk, then you are actually using the recombinant BST. Monensin, rumensin, essential oils are going to reduce greenhouse gases by about 7%. We already saw optimizing rumen fermentation. You could do that with a direct-fed microbial, a yeast product. You could be doing that with rumensin. You could be doing that with salicylate. You could be doing that with glycerol or some of the other essential oils. The feed additives, you saw that data. They can be players. You have to check the economics and the research on that. And, of course, the bottom one, if you increase forage quality, increase grain levels, and feed more fats and oils, that also reduces greenhouse gases. And that pretty much summarized everything we talked about for the last 30 minutes. But I'd be remiss if I didn't have to have my biases in this presentation. So I said, okay, our Secretary of Ag said we are going to have to meet this requirement. Therefore, I'm going to pass the Hutjens law, which says we only can have high-producing cows. So any cow that's producing less than 19,000 pounds of milk will have to be sold. All cows have to be milked 3 times a day because they'll be more efficient. We're going to look at smaller framed dairy-sized cows. All cows will have to be injected with RBST. Yeah, that could be pretty controversial. All cows will have to be fed an ionophore unless, of course, you're feeding organic milk. Producing organic milk. All heifers will calve in at 22 to 23 months of age because all they do is make manure from 23 to 24 to 25, 26 months of age, and that's where many dairy farms are at. Only cows that produce somatic cell counts below 400,000 will be allowed to be on the marketplace. That's probably going to happen anyway, but certainly that's going to be a winner on greenhouse gases. All cows in the United States will have to be fed be bred artificially to superior bulls. Some Scandinavian countries do that already, and it simply says we want better genetics in here because they produce more milk. And then all cows will have to be enrolled in some milk recording program so we know exactly which cows are the real winners on the dairy farm. So in summary, folks, it's here. We need to understand greenhouse gases, the relationship, where they come from, how they're produced, such things as the taxing, the maintenance requirements, higher milk production, and then, of course, the effects on feed efficiency at this point and how we measure it. This is going to be important, and certainly I think in the future you're going to see this revisited. We look at dairy technology, for example, the lack and inability in some markets not to use RBST versus the ability to have a more friendly dairy product. And some of these consumers in some of these markets may say we aren't going to be quite as restrictive in some of the technology we have out there. That completes our program for the day. Thanks. Have a good one.